For Creamer Media's Polity, I'm Motshabi Hoaeane. Researcher and analyst Professor Raymond Suttner discusses the significance of collective decision-making from the vantage point of Mandela's life and legacy. Thank you so much, Professor, for your time. You say that Mandela had an ambiguous relationship to collective decision-making. Is collective decision-making a good thing?
I raised this in the article that I wrote because what I find with writing on Mandela is they tend to use superlative adjectives or to call him an icon, and consequently we don't get to understand the controversies around Mandela's life, the choices that he made that were not universally popular. Now, the word collectivism, some people associate with communism, socialism, and they are suspicious of it. However, most organizations, if they are to be run effectively, have to operate on the basis of collective decisions. That is, if you expect someone to abide by a decision, they need to be part of that decision. Now, in the ANC, before 1949, when Sisulu became Secretary General, they didn't have collective decision-making. The president of the ANC was more or less a charismatic person, and that president used to make decisions, and once a year there would be a conference. If they didn't like the decisions, they'd throw him out or criticize them, so forth. But just before Sisulu became president, Dr. A.B. Xuma had been president of the ANC, and he had started to develop an organization and a national working committee that would meet once a week, but it was still primarily decisions made by the president. An example of this would be when they wanted to establish the ANC Youth League, they didn't address the ANC leadership as a whole. They went to see Dr. Xuma, and he said it's okay. And also later, when they wanted to introduce a program, ANC Youth League's program of action, at the 1949 conference, they went to see Dr. Xuma and said to him, will you support this? And he said no. So they said, well, then we won't support your re-election as president. He got furious. And but what is interesting about it is they didn't try to impress a wider leadership collective. Now, from Sisulu's time, they did operate as a collective. And Mandela, when he came to the Witwatersrand, was not politically aware. He really knew very little about politics. Where he came from, there were very few whites. But he learned soon enough in Johannesburg that whites didn't treat black people very well, and he got involved in the Youth League. And you see in this period that Mandela changes quite a lot. And in the 1950s, although there was this collective decision-making, Mandela was rapped on the knuckles on more than one occasions for saying things that were not mandated, that were not part of the decision-making of the ANC. For example, around the time of Sophiatown removals, he implied that they might resist this by force. Also in 1961, he was interviewed and he said, after the police had tried to suppress a strike by force, he said, "We have closed the chapter on non-violence." Now, MK had not been formed. There had been no decision to say non-violence was over. And Mandela, on both these occasions, was hauled over the coals, and he had to apologize. But characteristically, Mandela, in his long walk to freedom, says that he was right, even though he was hauled over the coals. But this ambiguous attitude towards the collective manifests itself again in the time when Mandela starts talks with the regime. Now, in prison, in general, he didn't do things on his own because you couldn't. Everything that you did, if you approached the authorities, now I know this from my own experience in prison, if you approach the authorities and you ask for X or Y, you don't realize that while you want X or Y, it can have a negative effect on the other people with whom you're sharing prison conditions. So you need to consult them. And Mandela in general, although he was a leader amongst the prisoners, he did consult. But when he came to the conclusion that in the 1980s there was a possibility of getting talks going that could lead to a negotiated settlement, he consulted no one. And his reasons for consulting no one was not that he was isolated, was not that he couldn't contact or send a message to the ANC in Lusaka. His reason was that if I had consulted, I would have been stopped. So Mandela consciously decides to act against the collective. Now, in the eyes of many revolutionaries, that is a crime. Now, the reason why Mandela did this, and I outlined this to some extent in my article, is that he rightly understood that if you want to start talks with the other side, the apartheid regime, you have to do it confidentially, secretly. And he knew when he did this that people would attack him. That some people might say, how can you go and do this on your own? And you are egotist, individualist, or even a traitor to the cause. And some people did say this. But he understood, he took that risk because he believed that there was a stalemate between the apartheid regime and resistance, and he wanted to break that stalemate. And indeed, when he started to get the dialogue going, he made it very clear that it was not for him, Nelson Mandela, to conduct talks, but he was paving the way for negotiations between the ANC leadership and the apartheid regime. So Mandela has this ambiguity throughout his life with the collective, and it may not have stopped there because a lot of decisions that were made, let's say at the beginning of negotiations, were presented to the rest of the ANC. For example, the suspension of armed action. But that was not Mandela alone, it was others with him.
You also say that to learn from Mandela is not to consider a simple set of rules, but requires studying from the lessons of his life. What are those lessons, Professor?
Well, I'm not the only person who can say these are the lessons. The thing that I'm trying to say is that all of us, if we want to learn from Mandela, and I believe that Mandela is an important model of leadership, he is an important model for men in a time when we have violence. He is an important model of morality and ethics from whom we should learn, but it's not obvious what the lessons are. What I find most interesting about Mandela, and this is something that should strengthen all of us, empower all of us, is that Mandela changed throughout his life. Now, Anthony Sampson, in his biography of Mandela, says he wants to get to the unchanging man that was Mandela. And underneath all the phases of his life, there is really some core that never changed. Now, I contest that. I believe that the Mandela who grew up in Tembuland, believing that he was totally free, preparing himself not to be a leader, but to train another person to be a leader, the future king of the Tembu, that Mandela changed a lot when he reached the Witwatersrand. Even the very act of defying the regent and fleeing to the Witwatersrand to avoid an arranged marriage, that was a breach with what he'd been before. Equally, the Mandela who goes into politics is at first a fairly extreme African chauvinist in the ANC Youth League. But he gradually learns. Along the way, he breaks up meetings of the Communist Party, the Indian Congress. He's well known for his rough tactics in those days. And Mandela was a tough guy. He was a boxer. But he comes to accept that it is better for the ANC to work with allies from the Indian Congress and the Communist Party. In those days, he is involved in militant struggle, but it's peaceful. But he comes to believe that it's necessary to take up armed struggle. He becomes Commander-in-Chief of Umkhonto weSizwe. But Mandela was not a warlord. He was not wanting violence for violence's sake or armed struggle for armed struggle's sake. That is why he was willing to change and to enter into talks. And when those talks started, the imagery around Mandela was consciously chosen in order to emphasize an inclusive leadership, that he was making gestures to say to whites, you have nothing to fear from us. His smile, his way he used to dance, all of these things were ways of reassuring people. So what we see with Mandela is that while he was spontaneous, for example, with young kids, there was something very conscious in the imagery that he used as his life changed. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was Professor Raymond Suttner on studying the lessons of Madiba's life.